And this Shabbat, we're really blessed to have Lindsey Newman speaking to us. Lindsey is the program manager and New York regional director at Lashon, an organization that advocates for the racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity of the Jewish community. Prior to Lashon, Lindsey worked in the fields of women's rights and advocacy and early childhood education. She received her BS in Industrial and Labor Relations from Cornell University in 2009, and this year Lindsey is participating in the second cohort of the Ruskay Institute Fellowship for Jewish Professional Leadership, and in some way most special to us, although her bio speaks for herself, Lindsey grew up in this community. She's the daughter of Harvey Newman and Stephanie Newman, Zichrona Levracha, and we've watched her become the woman that she's become and the teacher that she's become and the advocate, and we're really, really blessed to have her teach her words of Torah today.
Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. So this weekend marks the celebration of, I did grow up, yes. This weekend marks the celebration of one of this country's most profound spiritual leaders, a modern-day prophet and a defining moral compass for America, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This also happens to be one of the busiest weeks of the year for Jews of color around the country, who will be asked to participate in ceremonies honoring Dr. King, the civil rights movement, and the storied Black-Jewish relationship. And if you listen closely enough, you can hear the faint sounds of the many gospel choirs performing in synagogues and Jewish communities across the country. But in all seriousness, I'm honored to be asked to share some thoughts today in celebration of the work of a personal hero of mine. I appreciate that I was asked to speak today not only because of the color of my skin, but because of the causes that I champion and the work that I am doing in pursuit of an inclusive Jewish community with B'chol Lashon. B'chol Lashon is an organization that advocates for racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity in the Jewish community. The term B'chol Lashon is a Hebrew term. When translated, it means in every tongue or in every language. And I do this work because I believe that a Jewish community that embraces its differences is a stronger, more vibrant, and more just Jewish community. So I thought I might start with my own story. As is true for many Jews of color, I am often asked to share my story. And when I do share my story, it is not unusual for those that I may not know, upon realizing that I am Jewish, to expect me to have an exotic story. But the reality is that I consider my story to be a very typical American Jewish story. I grew up here on the Upper West Side, one of the most heavily and most visibly Jewish areas I have ever lived. Growing up, I was a part of a large, vibrant community here at B'nai Jeshurun. I completed the holy triumvirate of Jewish summer camp, teen trips to Israel, and swimming lessons at the 92nd Street Y. In fact, almost exactly 18 years ago this month, I stood here at this very bima and became a bat mitzvah. While all of this is part of my Jewish story, there are a few other important parts that define my Jewish story, including the fact that I am a Jew who happens to be Black, mixed race, and adopted. I like to describe my story as uniquely typical, while recognizing that we all have our own uniquely typical stories which are woven together to make one large patchwork called the Jewish people. I also recognize that nowhere but in America is my story possible. I was born the daughter of a white German-American Catholic woman and a Black man whose African ancestors were most likely brought to this continent as slaves. And I was raised by two Ashkenazi Jewish parents whose roots were planted in the bourgeois capitals and rundown shtetls of Eastern Europe. In addition to this being a very American story, the work that I am doing on a daily basis in our community is so that one day it is also recognized as a very Jewish story. The fact is that the Jewish community has always been one of the most diverse and global people on the planet. Some of the earliest diaspora communities were established in places like Ethiopia and India, where there have been Jewish communities practicing since the time of King Solomon more than 2,000 years ago. With every successive migration, Jews have brought their traditions and cultural knowledge with them, while also adapting to the norms of their new neighbors. While the Jewish community has a rich history of ethnic and racial diversity to draw upon, here in America, our Jewish community is affected by shifting demographic trends that are increasing the instances and awareness of this diversity. America at large is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. Among American children, the multiracial population has increased by almost 50% since 2000, making it the fastest growing youth group in the country. It is estimated that by the year 2042, minorities will comprise a majority of the US population. Similarly, trends such as intermarriage, conversion, and adoption are increasing the prevalence of racial and ethnic diversity in the American Jewish community. Research conducted by Lashon in 2004 found that Jews are more diverse than many might assume. Nearly 20% of America's 6 million Jews identify as Latino, African American, Asian, mixed race, and/or Sephardi or Mizrahi. While this number might have been shocking to some when it was first released 14 years ago, further studies, such as the New York Jewish Community Survey of 2011, have confirmed Lashon's findings. The New York Jewish Community Survey revealed that 12% of New York Jewish households are non-white, or those identifying as Black, Asian, Hispanic, or bi or multiracial. And 13% of New York Jewish households are Sephardic. Stated another way, nearly a quarter of New York Jews are living in diverse households. The numbers I cited just now reflect the contemporary choices of many American Jews. The interpretation of those choices and trends, to me, points to an exciting Jewish future, one in which my story will cease to be an anomaly, but increasingly be accepted as part of the norm. The challenge that we face is to find communal cohesion and a positive vision for the Jewish future, despite our differences in race, ethnicity, geography, class, ritual practice, and beliefs. Given the fact that the Jewish community has always been diverse and is growing more so, I believe that there's an incredible opportunity here for the Jewish community to embrace and accentuate the multiplicity of Jewish history and our contemporary reality. In the past, the expansion and free-form development of Jewish identity, the subsequent breakdown of communal boundaries, and the integration of Jews into wider multicultural American society might have been interpreted as a threat to communal cohesion. But I think the diversification of American culture, which makes possible the realization of Dr. King's dream, presents us with an incredible opportunity. Young Jews, whether they identify as racially and ethnically diverse or not, are growing up in a globalized world. The youngest generations are growing up with unlimited access to information and agency in the development of their identities, and many cite multiculturalism as an important value by which they engage with the world. All of these factors present an opportunity for Jewish identity to anchor the many identities that young Jews hold, highlighting the relevance of our Jewish identity in an age of eroding societal barriers and increasingly permeable communities. There are many ways that we can prepare ourselves for this future. The first of which is to participate in the difficult conversations that might come up when engaging across these defined differences. Race is a difficult topic for many to talk about in this country, but I think the Jewish community is poised to be at the forefront of that conversation. We have already begun this here at BJ, where for the past year, we have brought Lashon's Passport to Peoplehood curriculum that teaches about race, identity, and Jewish communities all around the world to the Hebrew school. This curriculum acknowledges the importance of individual narratives in stretching our understanding of the experiences of others and helping us gain more insight into ourselves. The stories we learn about others are equally as important as those we tell about ourselves. These values are reflected in Jewish tradition that has been passed down for centuries, and is of course why we read the Torah. It is meaningful that we are honoring Dr. King during this time in the secular calendar, and meanwhile we are reading in the Torah about the Israelites who are on the cusp of their redemption from slavery in Egypt. This week we read the Parsha, Vayera, where God reminds Moses that God appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and established a covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan. God goes on to state that God has heard the cries of their enslaved ancestors and remembers their covenant and will redeem them. Vayera is commonly translated as, "and I appeared," though that may actually be the incorrect translation. Several commentators point to the fact that the word vayera could be read in either the past or the future tense, I appeared or I will appear. This change in tense is a change in perspective. Stated in the past tense, God is reminding Moses of a past that he could not remember, while in the future tense, God is revealing to Moses a future he could not yet know. God sent Moses to Pharaoh to demand our freedom. Like Moses, Dr. King delivered a divine message of liberation too. Liberation from the bondages of racism, poverty, and militarism. Dr. King was telling us a very specific story about ourselves, one in which he reminds us that love is the supreme unifying principle of life, and that we are capable of overcoming the fallibility of human nature. So what distinguished Moses and Dr. King from the rest of their followers, whereby they became not just leaders, but prophets? In preparing my thoughts for today, I actually found the Devar Torah that I delivered here 18 years ago on my bat mitzvah. And in it, I quoted scholar Nechama Leibowitz, who said, "Miracles, however awe-inspiring, cannot change human nature. They can only momentarily shake the human soul out of its everyday concepts, but they cannot in themselves affect a lasting transformation." What uplifted Dr. King, like Moses, was the dedicated persistence to achieving justice in this world, so that every action he took was in the pursuit of that justice, even in the face of great danger and eventual death. We need not all achieve what Dr. King achieved or change the hearts of pharaohs like Moses did in order to make meaningful and lasting change in our world. But we can look to them for the inspiration to dedicate ourselves to constant examination and reflection to build resistance to moral failures. It might be difficult, but it is also simple. I do not claim to have all the answers to structural racism and how to conquer the systems of oppression that harm our society, but I do have a firm belief that honestly examining who we are and how we define ourselves is where we need to start. Any glance at the public discourse within the Black community shows that Black people talk about being Black all the time. Indeed, most Jews engage in a constant interrogation of our Jewishness. What makes us Jewish? How can we be more Jewish? Are we too Jewish? How come they don't do Jewish like we do Jewish? My wish would be that the Jewish community could approach the topic of race and racial identity with the same dedication and depth of inquiry. While most white people, including Jews who are white, do not talk about race and might see themselves outside the American racial paradigm, describing their race as a passive attribute, I'd encourage us to investigate that. In a commentary on the Whiteness Project, an interactive investigation into how Americans who identify as white experience their race through video interviews, the artist Whitney Dow wrote, "I have found that honestly examining the role my racial identity plays in my day-to-day life, and in fact how it has shaped my life's entire arc, has been incredibly illuminating and enhanced the quality of all my relationships regardless of the ethnic makeup of those involved. My experiences working on this project have repeatedly shown me that when white people honestly engage on this topic, it makes all discussions about race more productive and opens conduits to understanding that ultimately help to advance a culture of true equality." In his speech on race in Philadelphia in 2008, Barack Obama described the complexities of race in this country that we've never really worked through as a part of our union that we have yet to perfect. He goes on to stress the importance of understanding our history as an essential part of understanding our current reality. And he reminds us that while our union may never be perfect, it can always be perfected. I realize that we are yet to be freed from the forces that enslave us, such as racism, misogyny, homophobia, and xenophobia. Furthermore, those instruments of oppression are being freely paraded and currently displayed proudly by many in our society. But at the same time, I also realize that this is the best time in American history to be a person of color, a woman, and probably a Jew too. And so while I think it's important that we stay vigilant in identifying and naming both obvious and hidden prejudices and oppression, I also work hard to remind myself how important it is to look to the future with hope and optimism. As long as we can do this, I know we won't go backwards. We will continue to move this country forward in the service of progress. But it also has to come from each one of us, since every one of us has a stake in the conversation and a role to play. Too often, our discussions of the work and legacy of civil rights heroes like Dr. Martin Luther King are squarely rooted in the past, framing the conversation as one of history. Va'era, he appeared, a simple recitation of what took place back then, when in reality is the Va'era of the future, the I will appear that means the most. Dr. King will appear in the expression of our hopes for a more equitable future for our children. He will appear any time we take a moment to examine the quiet prejudices and forgotten biases that remain inside all of us. I know the work of progress happens not only on the largest stages of society, but in the intimate spaces we inhabit as well. Sometimes that means embracing discomfort, struggle, and uncertainty. Thinking of Dr. King, his story reminds me that it will more often be messy and difficult than obvious and easy, and that progress doesn't always follow a straightforward path. But I know I'm up for the challenge, and I take comfort in those that stand beside me in this journey. Thank you.